Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we heat up weird and wonderful science in your brain. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition you'll hear the second half of questions from the audience being answered by the Frontiers of Science Forum speakers on biology, chemistry, physics and mathematics. But first up, here's news of the climate rebellion. Climate scientists arrested. In the week of the report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, over 1,000 climate scientists around the world protested against the actions of the governments of the world that could lead to irreversible climate emergency if we don't take drastic action before 2025. The report says our civilization cannot adapt to increasingly severe wild weather in the form of fatal heat waves, flash floods, wildfires and droughts. When the heat waves are over 50 degrees Celsius, birds and bats drop dead from the trees, farm animals die and plants start to die. Both Queensland and New South Wales suffered catastrophic floods in the week the report was released. Even worse, the Australian government was given a report in 2021 that predicted the floods of 2022, how severe they would be and even where and when they would happen. By choosing to suppress this report, the Australian government not only failed to save lives and property by refusing to act, but they also robbed flood-affected people of the choice to take protective measures themselves. Former Australian Capital Territory Emergency Services Authority Commissioner, Major General Peter Dunn, said at a press conference it's pointless spending billions and billions of dollars on increasing the army, increasing navy capabilities, if the homeland is insecure. If communities are insecure, this is where national security starts, right here at home. There'll be nothing left to defend in 30 years if we don't do something now. After every disaster, the federal government initiates an inquiry but fails to implement the recommendations. In 2019, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison was warned that severe bushfires were on their way by the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, made up of 37 former emergency services leaders, and that Australia needed to buy more water tanker aircraft to deal with it, or massive irreversible damage would be done by the wildfires. The Prime Minister refused to meet. The Australian government did set up a $4.8 billion emergency response fund in an interest-bearing bank account with the idea that $200 million from the interest earned would be available every year for disaster prevention, mitigation and relief. But it's never been used. Minister for Emergency Management and National Recovery, Bridget Colour-Coded Spreadsheets McKenzie, explained they're saving the funds for when all other sources of funding have been exhausted. The fund earns nearly $1 billion in interest every year, which is just added to the fund. Rather than use government funds set aside for disasters, Defence Minister Peter Dutton started a GoFundMe page for the flood victims in his electorate of Dickson, which he illegally donated to a group that's not registered as a charity with close links to him, the Dickson Seniors Council. The Queensland Office of Fair Trading was forced to step in and Mr Dutton registered his own charity, the Pine Rivers Community Flood Relief. Although nobody knows how these funds will actually reach flood victims. The 2019 to 2020 wildfires are the worst Australia has suffered, with 5.5 million hectares of wilderness destroyed, bringing koalas near extinction, over 2,000 buildings burned, over 200 homes destroyed, and 26 lives lost. The Australian government promised $2 billion to the people who lost their homes, but failed to actually pay anything. People whose homes burned down are still living in tents and caravans in 2022. The government defended breaking this promise by claiming that the $2 billion was only notional. In 2020, the Australian Government held the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, which made 80 recommendations. The Australian Government has failed to implement any of them. In October 2021, the Australian body Emergency Management Australia under the Minister for Home Affairs were briefing states and territories that Australia could face flooding catastrophes in early 2022, and their maps predicted the exact areas that were in fact impacted by floods. The government chose not to release the report, endangering lives and property. Further, the Australian Government rejected applications for funding of over $150 million in flood mitigation projects, including a priority upgrade to Queensland's early flood warning infrastructure, despite their secret knowledge that massive floods were on the way. When the floods hit the east coast of Australia in early 2022 as predicted, the National Resilience and Recovery Agency only offered disaster relief funding to National Party-held local government areas, which excluded the nearby Labor-held areas that were just as badly affected or worse. Lismore, the city underwater, didn't even count as a disaster area despite being the worst flooded area in Australia, because its local government was Labor. This issue of emergency disaster funding being allocated on party lines caused North Coast-based Liberal Member for Parliament, Catherine Cusack, to announce she'll leave Parliament altogether. She's previously criticised her own government on its policies to kill koalas for profit for real estate developers. The Australian Environment Minister Susan Ley famously went to court to defend her government's right to hurt children. The 2018 UN Climate Change Report warned that we had until 2030 to offset our carbon dioxide emissions by planting trees to avoid catastrophic climate change. The Australian Government doubled down, setting up a fake carbon offset trading scheme with no new trees, appointing coal and gas executives to seats of power in the Prime Minister's office, the National COVID Commission, and many other roles where they did not belong, while spending billions in subsidies to coal and gas companies and improving more coal and gas mines. The Australian Government cynically funded the world's first export of hydrogen, which they claimed as a clean zero-carbon fuel, but which was made 100% from dirty fossil fuels. On the 5th of April 2022, the latest United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was released in the same week as the second round of floods in New South Wales and Queensland. This report says we have until 2025 to avoid a rise in global temperatures above 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that as a consequence, although we have time if we take drastic action now, the last 4 years of frantic fracking have meant that we're definitely seeing the sea levels rise, fatal heat waves, wildfires, droughts, and flash floods. The weather is becoming chaotic. Net zero is not enough, as it means continuing to emit carbon dioxide and methane at our current rates. Instead, we need to make heroic efforts to transition to genuinely zero emissions energy and manufacturing production as quickly as we can, while actually removing carbon dioxide that we've already emitted out of the atmosphere. This is not about capturing carbon dioxide released from natural gas mining, which is all that carbon capture and storage technology actually offers. We need to electrify everything in cities, including heating homes in the Northern Hemisphere with electric heat pumps powered by wind and solar, instead of them just burning gas and coal for the heat. This is enormously cheaper for consumers, as well as massively reducing emissions. The high-income countries that promised to fund the transition at the 2020 Paris Agreement all failed to pay the money they promised by over $100 billion a year. The report warns we're about to miss the window to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. If the governments of the world fail to take action, then our civilization could end in just 80 years by 2100, with the death of huge amounts of people, animals and plants. Yet Australia still plans to expand the fossil fuel industry with 72 new coal projects and 44 new gas projects under development, heavily supported by government subsidies. These projects would more than double Australia's gas and coal production, resulting in an extra 1.7 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases every year, equivalent to twice the emissions of global aviation. On the 6th of April 2022, the day after the report was released, more than 1,000 scientists around the world chained themselves to the doors of oil-friendly banks, blocked bridges and occupied the steps of government buildings. There were plans for a week of protest in 26 countries, but only the plan was reported in the press. Scientist rebellion's demands include training on the climate emergency, energy crisis and civilizational collapse to become part of all university degrees. Their campaign slogan is 1.5 degrees is dead, climate revolution now. The Guardian have a piece from climate scientist Peter Kalmus about how he and 9 other climate scientists locked themselves to the entrance of a JP Morgan Chase Bank building and were arrested by 100 riot police in Los Angeles. JP Morgan Chase funded the highest amount of new fossil fuel projects. That's it for the press. The only other information on the actual protests as they happened around the world was Twitter. A group of 100 scientists in Spain were prevented from throwing fake blood on the outside of the National Congress of Spain while holding cans emitting blue smoke. 53 of the Spanish scientists were arrested. In Denmark, the street in front of the Climate Ministry was blocked by 40 people, half of them scientists, holding posters and scientific papers and reading aloud from the IPCC report. In the Netherlands, 50 scientists marched and blocked an entrance to the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy and read from the IPCC report. 7 were arrested. In Berlin, 14 scientists chained and glued themselves to the street blocking of the Kronprinzenbruck Bridge for 4 hours in the centre of Berlin. In Switzerland, 18 scientists marched to the capital Bern to paste parts of the IPCC report and other climate science on the walls of the federal palace, and were stopped immediately by police. In Quito, Ecuador, a group of young scientists demanded that the Ministry of Environment stop expanding oil exploitation. In Sierra Leone, a teaching event with several stakeholders generated engagement and calls for climate action to policymakers. In Washington, D.C., American scientists chained themselves to the White House to demand action on the climate crisis from President Biden. Did any Australian scientists protest? I haven't been able to find out, as it's simply not reported anywhere. Don't look up.
You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com.
At the Frontiers of Science Forum in March 2022, Johannes le Coutre spoke about cellular agriculture. Martina Stenzel spoke about nanomedicine with polymers. Chirs Tisdell spoke about replacing compasses with templates in teaching geometry. And Ben Eggleton spoke about replacing electrons in our gadgets with light. After their talks, they joined me for the audience question and answer session. And here's the final part of the discussion with the audience.
I was trying to think of a question that could kind of synthesize all of the talks. Good luck. So my question is like this. I'm thinking of a template to really get to the next level of understanding how we can look at disease in cells or even cell function. I came across an interesting paper which was published fairly recently, which looked at thermal gradients in cells and the change in temperature across cells. And these very clever researchers got nanodiamonds and put them within the structures in the cell and found, in the mitochondria you'd expect it's a little bit hotter, but we didn't expect to find it was nearly 2 degrees hotter, not just fractions of a degree. So I'm thinking of your type of worlds that you're living in, and then I'm thinking of Ben's world, where he can put light into just about anywhere that he thinks about putting it. That could we have a new way of imagining the cell as taking things which are really at the moment like balls of string and unpacking them a little bit more elegantly using some of the tools that Ben has got and the toolkit that you've got to really get to functional analysis at the level of the cell instead of taking it out, putting it in a computer and hoping it's doing what is happening in the cell. So it's a very open-ended speculative question, but I was amazed by this paper really showing so elegantly that there are these thermal differentials in cells that nobody really knew about, and they're big.
Okay, so who wants to answer first?
I think this, I mean, that's your domain more than my domain, but I think they're starting to think that through. I mean, there are, what do we call that? Don't we have a name for that type of? Optogenetics, that's right. So that's a reasonably mature field of using light sources from outside the body to activate at the nanoparticle level and at the cellular level. Yeah. So yeah, indeed. Yeah, they're probably, you're more qualified than I am.
No, that's my previous research field, but out of Germany, a group has discovered a molecule very similar to our rhodopsin in our eyes called channel rhodopsin, which is basically a molecule that would let ions go through the membrane upon illumination with a photon, and that's again similar to the molecule I've been studying during my PhD, bacterial rhodopsin, which pumps proton, which makes a reference to your point about friction in the membrane, which heats up the mitochondria, and that's exactly what's happening there. So optogenetics, I would predict here, in front of everybody, will give a Nobel Prize at least to one of those German guys within the next 5 years. So don't quote me on that. So, but it's a super exciting field, and yes, I think at the end of the day, if I understand your question correctly, there might even be a way to build something like cellular computers that are controlled and guided by or switched on and off by light. I mean, yes, exactly. I can
even smaller machines.
I can see that very clearly at the horizon. Yes.
All right. So next question.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Ben as well, if it's okay.
Oh.
So, when we have like waveguides that they are very long, that there is like problems that photon excitations, and you may need to put extra energies and so on. So in a futuristic kind of like view, like could we picture, I don't know, like information transfer without like waveguides, so just by laser or anything like this?
Say it again in one sentence, and I'm not getting the essence of the question.
Yeah, so like from a futuristic point of view, okay.
Yeah.
So if we want like to further increase like kind of efficiency, or like could we try to devise a way to like transfer information without the physical support like of the wave?
Well, that's
like
sending light through space.
Yeah, for instance, or satellite, for instance, to ground.
We do that routinely.
Okay.
So, indeed, I mean, the simplest example of that is me standing on one side of a park with a torch and moving my hand up and down in front of it, and I'm creating a Morse code kind of signal. Someone on the other side of the room sees the light going on and off. So we do that, satellite communications, we do optical. Elon Musk is building a worldwide network based on low Earth orbit satellites. So yes, free space communications, that's a concept. It's mature. I mean, an example that makes it really clear, I was in New York at 9/11 when they knocked out downtown Manhattan. They knocked out the entire fiber optic network, and within 24 hours they had rolled out free space communications. And essentially it's like a telescope, a system that sends a laser from New York to New Jersey at the speed of light. Follow up.
Yep. I also wanted to mention about Starlink. That was a great example. And I just noticed that there is a lot of research at Macquarie going on about infrared lasers. And I'm just curious, when it comes to photonics on the chips, is there any preference in terms of wavelength? Would you like to have like blue light or probably like a red light? And what's the benefits of each?
Yeah, good question. We tend to fixate on the near infrared. As a research community, 1.5 microns, for one very simple reason, and that is optical fiber networks are designed to operate at 1.5 microns for a very simple reason, and that's because the erbium-doped fiber amplifier operates at 1.5 microns. So every amplifier in every optical network, every optical communication link on the planet relies on erbium-doped fiber to amplify light, and they operate at 1.5 microns. So for convenience, we always focus on 1.5 microns. But indeed, the infrared, the mid-infrared in particular, 2 microns to 10 microns is very interesting. Infrared, thermal, molecular fingerprint, interesting for sensors. Defence is very interested in the infrared. And then as you go to visible, there are numerous applications. So, yeah, good question. Silicon, as a great material for microelectronics and photonics, turns out to be very good at 1.5 micron. But the band gap of silicon is in the visible, and it's opaque in the visible. It's like brick in the visible. It's good at the near infrared, it's pretty good at the mid infrared, but it's completely opaque at the blue. Silicon nitride, another interesting material for photonics, is good in the visible, it turns out. Yeah, good question.
You can bring the microphone. Oh, sorry, there's one at the back. Will be you next.
This is the question might be a bit abstract at the moment because it's like a science fiction. But having great front peers here, I wish to put forward this idea, especially at this COVID situation. I'm thinking about people were talking about template, microelectronics, all that. But now, can we make lipid nanoparticles as a template which has the capacity to incorporate artificial intelligence, like machine learning capacity, that can actually monitor the variance, and then it can evolve itself within your body.
I'm sorry for this, but would you like to address that?
I think we have to come up with an answer together here.
A couple of decades, couple of billion.
I have an interesting perspective.
Okay.
Here we go.
It doesn't answer the question, but there is some really interesting research at Sydney and at UNSW in nanorobotics. So this is an emerging field. And we've looked, and Susan Ponders here was part of this discussion when you were director of Einstein Nano. We looked very seriously at the idea of constructing cellular scale hybrid CMOS lipid-based robots. Okay, so this is the concept from science fiction of constructing an autonomous, powered, mobile, functional particle of the order of the scale of the cell. Now, it's conceivable. Now, I made the point, how big is the size of the smallest transistor? I did say that in my presentation. 10 nanometers. 10 nanometers. So you can do the math. You can actually say, okay, if I have a cellular scale robot that has the ability at a cellular level. Now, remember, the cell's still much bigger than the DNA. So I'm miles away, but I'm a step towards it. I've got enough real estate. We've done the calculation. I've got enough real estate that I can load into that 10 to the 4 logic gates. It's not many. Unless I'm doing quantum computing, and don't even get me started on doing quantum computing, because quantum computing for the next 20 years is going to involve a building the size of the Faculty of Medicine and Health. Okay, so it's not going to be compatible. But that gives you an idea. So the notion of equipping a cellular scale functional component with intelligence, probably between 10 to the 4 and 10 to the 5 logic components is possible, which is not going to give you AI, but it might give you the basic analog functions to do sensing, communicate, navigate, process basic information. Then the last comment I would say is that at the level of the DNA, we've got researchers at Sydney and at UNSW who are exploring the notion of self-assembled DNA origami. So it turns out, and I'm less an expert than my colleagues here in this area, it turns out that DNA have some exquisite properties, including the ability to self-assemble and to self-assemble into functional components that are building blocks of DNA scale robots. Okay, so does that get a little bit close to what you're imagining? And I'll pass to my colleagues here who might want to build on That'll take it in a new direction.
No, I think you answered it really well. No, I'm not sure if I have anything to add there, but I think if we can fill these liposomes, but also use the liposome itself with some clever chemistry together, I think you can probably build something. But as I said, well, the space is still very small. Yeah, but we can, you're familiar with the liposome field, Sachi, so you know that we can have chemicals that respond to light, that respond to temperature, and change maybe their shape as well. Yeah. Yeah. So we can maybe have a level of control on top of it, but yeah, it's a nice idea. And then you have to feed the information back as well.
I have a question. If we're in the business of really out there. So I saw the latest James Bond movie. Now, aside from the fact that I'm pretty unhappy that the ending, I'm still confused.
No, it's written he will come back.
Well, that's right. So whatever was that, there was quite an incredible scene in the movie that talked about the idea of a weapon that is based on the ability to program a virus specific to the DNA of individuals. Pretty scary. So literally imagine the room we're in. Someone walks into this room and scans in real time every person in the room, and in real time has a database of their DNA. Now, it sounds extraordinary. Probably isn't that extraordinary. I mean, we look for RNA DNA in our sewage, and then can program a virus. This is the Hollywood movie. This is the James Bond. Is that conceivably possible in our lifetime? Is that just totally out there? Do you get what you've seen the James Bond movie?
Yes. I think it's...
I haven't, but I get the idea. Very evil thought. Well, I'm not... The idea is really somebody comes into this room here and has maybe a little scanner, and here we go, Johannes, that's it.
Well, yeah, so putting that aside, but can you program, the notion of programming a virus that is tailored to a specific DNA, an individual?
If I can say something,
yeah.
I think if we are, and we're doing this with nutrition, but it is sort of copied or just the evolution of personalized, and Martina mentioned this, personalized medicine led to personalized nutrition. So if we do personalized medicine, and we are doing it, and if we can heal people in a personalized way, we will also be able to kill them in a personalized way. Yeah, absolutely.
We already got one of those today. Here's a weapon of mass.
That was the final part of the Frontiers of Science Forum question and answer session. You can watch the whole event on YouTube.
And that's all from us this week on Diffusion. Are you a scientist, artist, biohacker or maker who'd like to be interviewed about your work? Would your company like to sponsor Diffusion? Send your contributions, opinions, helpful suggestions and donations to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. Please subscribe to the Diffusion Science Radio channel on youtube.com/c/Diffusion Radio and rate the show on iTunes. Tell your friends. Follow me on Twitter @Ian Woolf. The news music was Rhinos Theme by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 28 stations on the Community Radio Network, including Radio Blue Mountains 89.1 FM in New South Wales, 8CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2 MVR in Nambucca Valley, 3 MBR in the Mallee Border districts of Victoria and South Australia, City Park Radio 7LTN in Launceston, Tasmania, and 2XXFM in Canberra. Diffusion is narrowcast on Indigo FM 88 in northeast Victoria. Diffusion is syndicated globally on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to the podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com, and check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. If you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 1,000 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Make a donation through paypal.me/Ian Woolf, or join my patrons at patreon.com/diffusionradio. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.